Hello and welcome back. Some of you might recognize this palette here because this is my first well-based palette. So not one that uses the little like half pans and full pans, instead you pour directly in. And this is my largest palette that I use, but I haven't really used this palette much within the last few years. Definitely not as my main palette. This used to be my main palette, but I've been using my studio travel palette that's a little bit smaller than this one as my main palette for the last year. But I've left that palette in the US intentionally for when I move over there, and I'm back in the UK now, and I decided that I would try and use this one as my main palette in the meantime, and that just helps me with moving things over there. But my painting habits and my colour choices have changed quite considerably since this was my main palette. So what I've done is I've changed out some of the colours, and I'm going to go over some of those colours today. I'm going to swatch out especially this one here, because this one is actually a mixture that I've put together that I use a lot in my painting, and talk a little bit about why I've changed things. And I might do a painting or something at the end of this, we'll see. I have a pencil here for pointing, but we have Nicolazzo yellow here. It's my main mixing yellow, and it was my main mixing yellow on this palette. It still is, so that's why that's still here. This was already on the palette. This here is New Gamboge, and I added it at the time to have a warm yellow option. It's from the remains of my Essentials set that I got years ago to first foray into professional watercolours. This one's Transparent Pyrrole Orange. Then we have Pyrrole Scarlet. I love both of these as warm reds. Then we have PV19 Rose, the Quinacridone Rose. Then Moonglow. I don't normally have this on my palettes, and I think this is the only palette I have this on. Also, there's lots of cat hair, so I apologize for that. But I really like the effect of Moonglow, and this is the last of it that I have, I believe. I might have a tiny bit left in the 5ml tube I have, but I'm keeping that. Then Ultramarine Blue, Indanthrone Blue. I love these two still, so they're staying. This is Prussian Blue, and it's not a colour I use at all anymore, but I used to absolutely love it, and I'm pretty sure that's where my love of Indanthrone Blue comes from, is my original love of Prussian Blue, because they're both very moody blues, and I'll show them both in a moment in some swatching. This is Cerulean Blue Chromium. I love this for special effects, and I still use it, so I'm keeping it on here. This is one that I switched out. So this was originally Amazonite Genuine, and since I have Phthalo Green on the palette here, I didn't feel the need of having both of them, because Amazonite Genuine at full strength looks almost exactly like Phthalo Green. So I swatched them out here. This one is Amazonite Genuine, and this one is Phthalo Green. It doesn't look very green on the camera, but just imagine it being slightly more green than this, or I might colour adjust it, but they look very, very similar. So I ended up getting rid of that one and keeping this one. And in its place, what I've added is a mixture of two colours that I tend to use together a lot, and that is this puddle here. And let's see if we have it. It's this mixture. So I was trying to come up with a neutral for me to use, so almost like a chromatic black basically, because I do find myself mixing chromatic black quite a lot, especially when I'm doing animals and like animal portraits and things like that, to hit things like big cat eyes or the nostrils of animals and things like that. And one of my favorite combinations to create a chromatic black is this, and this is PBR 25 which is over here, and I'll go over that in a moment, mixed with phthalo turquoise. It's a very specific combination to produce this. Now, I do love these here as well. This is another one of my favorite combinations. This is Indanthrone Blue and the PBR 25, but I decided that instead of this combination, which I usually like to do to try and get a mixture of warms, so warms here and cools, and I like to try and get that colour variation. That's easier to do, the colour variation, when you are mixing it in the moment. Whereas when I just want to pick up a chromatic black, I tend to lean more towards wanting this. So I ended up going with the phthalo turquoise mixed with PBR 25. So that's the first major change. So we have the phthalo green. This is the next change. This was originally sap green. I don't really use convenience greens anymore, and I don't really reach for them anymore. I like to mix my own. So Azo green is a green that I've been using a lot in my studio travel palette over the last year, and I'm really starting to fall in love with it. So I've added that in, and I took the sap green out. And then here we have yellow ochre. That one's Daniel Smith. This one is transparent, not transparent, quinacridone burnt orange. I nearly said transparent pyrrole orange. It is quinacridone burnt orange. This is another colour, much like the Prussian blue, that I used to absolutely love, and I used to put it in every palette. I used it on every painting, but it's a colour I've not really used in a long time, so I'm wanting to kind of re-experience that love again and get used to it again. This is my PBR 25, so the one that I used for this mixture. This is brown red, and you can find it in a few different brands. This one at the moment is Shinhan, but I've currently run out of the tube, so I'm probably going to try another brand to replace it, and I'm leaning towards the Holbein version of PBR 25 at the moment to try out, which I've never tried before. And that one I think is called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but imidazoline brown. And this is burnt umber. At the time of me using this palette, I didn't have a burnt sienna. I used to use burnt umber as my main brown a lot. And then over time things changed. I ended up falling in love with PBR 25. And then when I moved to using the Studio Travel palette a bunch, I fell in love with burnt sienna again. And I like having all three of these on my palette. In general, most palettes I use now, I like to have these three and yellow ochre, bare minimum, for my earth tones. Then, so I added here the burnt sienna. This was originally, I'm trying to think, what was it? I think this was a purple that I mixed. Yeah, this was a purple that I mixed. And then this one here was, it's now Lunar Earth, but it was originally what's now in here. So when I took these out, I squished them into full pans. This is ultramarine pink, and it's ultramarine pink from Roman Schmalz. Roman Schmal? It was in a full pan, and what I did was I took it out of that full pan and then stuck it into this palette by wetting the surface and pressing it down, and when it dried it stuck down. But I ended up removing it, putting it back into the full pan and bringing in another earth tone. So this is Lunar Earth. It's very similar in hue, slightly more orange though than the burnt sienna. And this I'm exploring. This is my exploring colour for the palette. I haven't actually used it in any paintings yet, I don't think. I've only really swatched with it, played around with it in colour mixing and things like that. The main draw of this colour to me is its granulation. It's way more heavily granulating than the burnt sienna. So we have that to play around with. So to go over the blues that I had on here, this is Indanthrone. This is ultramarine. Is that a wasp? There is a wasp in my room. I will be right back. I think the wasp has evacuated the building. I cannot find it anymore. The windows are open. I think we're good. So this is Prussian blue, the Indanthrone blue, and the ultramarine. If I'm ever not sure of whether I want to change a colour out or not, I like to swatch all of the colours I have within that hue range. So in this case I swatched out my blues, and that one's the cerulean blue chromium. I swatched out my blues and I swatched out the blue leaning greens. And through this I was able to figure out that that was the only one that I wanted to get rid of, the Amazonite green, or the Amazonite genuine, because I feel like in this, Prussian blue still has a place for me at the moment. It has this, it's more of a middle-ish leaning blue if you look at charts that place all of the pigments. But when you have it comparatively next to other colours, it can be used as a slightly more green leaning. Because a lot of the time when you're doing, if you're saying that a colour is warm or a colour is cool, a lot of the time you're comparing it to the colours around it to determine that warmth or that coolness. So in this case, this is the cooler of these three. And then obviously this is way cooler because this is a green. If I feel like I'm just not reaching for the Prussian blue, then what I'll do is I'll take it out, I'll squish it into a full pan to put on my, like, experimenting or to use whenever. Don't know what this is. I think this is a bit of the tissue I use to clean the palette. Distractions. I'll end up squishing it into a full pan to put into my, like, big tin that I have, where I just have a bunch of full pans to pull out for using one time on a painting. And then I'll put in probably phthalo blue green shade in here, or phthalo turquoise, because I do really love phthalo turquoise. And then it would also fit nicely with this, but we'll see. For now, I'm excited to keep using or to rediscover Prussian blue. I think that kind of covers me doing this. This puddle here, if you're wondering what this is a really washed out, thinned down Prussian blue, because I had a problem with a painting or with an illustration. This was going to be an illustration that I was filming, and I've had to scrap it because the surface sizing of the paper has gone bad. So this is just going to be a little side tangent PSA for people. Your art supplies, some art supplies do have an expiration date. It won't be on it like food, but your supplies can expire. Some things don't really expire, like pencils don't really expire, but watercolour paper is particularly bad for it, and the environment you keep it in can have a massive difference too, like if it's very, very humid, for example. But in the case of this, I'll just move this out of the way for the moment. What tends to happen is, no matter if the humidity is high or low, if a paper's old, if it's sat around for a while, the sizing can start to go bad. What happened here, if you can see, is, do you see all those dots? The texture that's showing up? An indicator that your paper is starting to go bad or has gone bad is unwanted textures. So this is the same wash, the same puddle as this. And it was doing it not just with the Prussian blue, but underneath this, it's probably too pale for you to see, but there is yellow ochre covering the whole of the bird, and you can see it happening even in the yellow ochre in person. Like there you can kind of see it a bit on camera. In person it's a lot more obvious, but I ended up having to scrap this. I'm going to redo this illustration on some other watercolour paper. So this is watercolour board. I'm really bummed by this though, because this board hasn't been sat around. It's not like I bought this years ago and I've had it sat in my stash or whatever for 3 years and not used it. I bought this summer. This was the watercolour boards you saw me get in that haul from the Try Me pack. And the wasp is back! Woo! Be right back. Long story short, painting didn't end up turning out because of the materials, so I'm leaving it for now, doing another illustration, and I'm filming that one instead. This I'm going to re-explore again in the future, but for right now I am putting it on hold, and I'll redo it after I do a couple illustrations. So that's what that one was. This here is me trying to mix this correctly. I was trying to reach this hue. This was too much of the phthalo turquoise, so you can kind of see how this black can shift depending on how much of the phthalo turquoise you use. Welcome to the voiceover portion of the video, and I decided that to test the palette and the changes that I made, and to also reacquaint myself with some of the colours, I was going to do a little painting. So this is a 5 by 7 inch block, so roughly A5, and I decided to do a ballpoint pen sketch. So I did straight ballpoint pen, I didn't do any pencil under sketch, it's just a Bic black ballpoint pen. And usually when I do my ink and watercolour pieces, I'll do a pencil sketch first, then I'll do the inking, wait for that to dry, get rid of the pencil, and then I'll do the watercolour, which can take quite a bit of time, but that's also a process that I really love for illustration. When it comes to sketching, I quite like ballpoint pen with watercolour over the top, and it just shortens the process a little bit for me, so that was perfect for doing something to just test the palette out and figure out if there was anything that I wanted to change. And I did end up changing something by the end of this painting, because I realised why I don't like one of the pigments on this palette. So we'll get to that as we get further in, but you can see me immediately jumping into using the mixed black here for the nostrils. So this is that black that uses phthalo turquoise and brown red, or red brown. I think it's brown red. Yes, brown red. As many of you know, I constantly get which way around it is wrong, but the two pigments mixed to make a chromatic black is what I'm using here to start off setting some of the darkest darks in place, and then I'm moving in with starting the textures for the fur. Oh, I didn't mention the subject that I'm painting is a bison calf, and it's from the same reference pack that I used for the An Hour in My Sketchbook video when I was drawing ravens. This is the Yellowstone #1 Spring reference pack over on Creature Art Teacher, and I think I picked it up when it was on sale a while back. The reference packs occasionally go on sale, so it's worth just checking in occasionally if you're ever wanting to pick up reference. But I really love this pack because it has quite a wide variety of animals that I don't typically get to see in the UK, like bison. And I was really drawn into the colours on the calf, because the calves have this really like rusty, almost orangey fur, and it was really vibrant against the greens of the grass. So that was what drew me into painting a calf rather than the adult bison that are in the pack. But I haven't drawn maybe I've sketched some of the bison, but I definitely haven't painted the bison from that pack before, so this was a new experience for me in that regard too. But I wanted to really capture the orangey warmth of the fur and also the coolness of the shadows. That was the main thing I was trying to play around with in this. And then for the background, I wanted to really try and use the Lunar Earth pigment, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I'm setting up something for you here, but anyway, I started off by getting the darkest darks in place, and then it was a matter of starting to build up the different hues and textures in the fur and also the main areas of shadow. So I already started establishing that a little bit with the underwash, the underpainting, where there are the more sort of yellowy orange muted areas, the reddish muted areas, and then the slightly more blue areas. And that started to sort of set up where it was a lot more warm and also where it was a lot cooler. In general, it was a lot cooler on the downward facing planes, but also on the top of the snoot, which is turned down slightly. That was very cool alongside the underside of the neck and also the sort of the side planes of the shoulders as you're going further up. The shoulders are slightly cut off from this, but in general that's roughly where I was going for with the cool areas that I was noticing. And I didn't want to spend too much time rendering all of the fur, so I spent most of the texture time in the light. So I spent more time putting in the textures where it was a lot warmer, and then on the cooler areas I tried to make sure that I at least had like 2 layers but didn't go too in depth, because at the end of the day I was trying to do this relatively quickly, but I still ended up getting a little bit carried away. Even the sketch was a little bit carried away with fur details. I tried to abstract them a little bit, but I did get a little bit carried away. I just got excited. I don't know how many other people out there might relate to that, when you're like, I'm just gonna do a quick hour-long thing, and then you get really, really excited and an hour-long project turns into a 3-hour-long project or something. I'm not saying this took 3 hours, that's just me pulling a number off the top of my head. I honestly don't actually remember how long this took me. I kind of got lost in the flow a little bit after starting, but I'm probably sure I could calculate it by going back and figuring out how long the speed paint took and stuff, but I didn't record the sketch of this. But anyway, I'm rambling on a bit. I used a mixture of different browns to form the warm fur tones, and I especially tried to use the quinacridone burnt orange, which I haven't used in quite a long time. It's been long enough that I can't remember the exact reason why I stopped using it, but I think it was in part due to a mixture of wanting to try out some other pigments, and then I just ended up getting lost in the use of those new pigments, or it was also due to fears about quinacridone paints in that area becoming discontinued. And I believe quinacridone burnt orange is now discontinued, but most manufacturers still have a good healthy supply of it in stock, of the pigment. So I don't know how long this paint's going to be around for, but I might I might just end up enjoying it while I can now, rather than worrying about not being able to access it. I remember first playing around with the idea of watercolours when there was the big quinacridone gold, the big quinacridone gold drama, and some of you may have been more into the painting scene when that happened. Some of you might not even know what I'm on about, but there was a paint that a lot of people loved, which was quinacridone gold, and it became discontinued. I believe, roughly from the top of my head, what happened was that It used to be a very commonly used pigment in the paint industry, and it just ended up not becoming a common color anymore. And the car painting industry is so much larger than the artist industry for pigments that it can drive the production of the synthetic pigments. And the quinacridone gold pigment ended up just not being manufactured anymore, and a lot of paint suppliers ended up not having the pigment stockpiled, or they couldn't find it before it was discontinued. So a lot of manufacturers almost immediately stopped producing the paint, and there were a few people talking about stocking up on whatever tubes they could find, and all sorts of shenanigans going on. And you can still find quinacridone gold in brands now, but they use a hue, so they mix colors, and it's usually mixed with this quinacridone burnt orange and another color. Not always, brand to brand, but some of them do use this, which I believe is PO48, but now PO48 is also becoming discontinued, and at least I think it is. I need to double check, but it's a shame because this one's a really lovely colour. I never got to try quinacridone gold because, like I said, I was only just starting to get into the world of watercolours when that was happening. Yeah, I guess it's just something that you kind of get used to with traditional media, as things not becoming available anymore and having to have some level of consistency and yet also adaptability. But yeah, I'm gonna just enjoy it while I have it, I think, and not worry too much about it, because as far as I know, it should be around for a while. I think the quinacridone gold drama, I guess you could probably say, caused a lot of people to, or a lot of manufacturing companies for paint to actually stockpile some pigments a little bit more, but we'll see what happens. Anyone of my art friends, like maybe Lana or maybe Lee and Gold as well, I have a few paint friends through Lana's Discord that might be able to give more information on the quinacridone situation in the comments. If I hear anything from them as well, I might put it in the comments as well, but they might be able to give you more advice about, or not advice, but information about what was going on with quinacridone gold and things like that. But to get back to the painting, as you can see here, I'm now starting to add the areas of shadow, and I'm going in with just large block areas because in part I'm wanting to block in the shadows, and also I'm trying to, as I mentioned, simplify the shadow areas, and one of the best ways of doing that is to simplify it into a single shape. I'm using, I think if I remember correctly here, a mixture of Indanthrone and some other blues, and then I muted it down a touch with the browns. I do that in part because if I went straight in with a pure blue, even Indanthrone, it can be quite punchy, and I didn't want it to just scream blue. Even with it knocked back a little bit, you can see how blue it can appear next to the orangeness of the browns, because even the browns can look very, very vibrant if they're not knocked down a bit, depending on the colours you use around it. And that's something that is just a constant thing to keep in mind when you're painting, is colour theory, woo! I would probably say that the area that I struggled with the most was the top of the head, because there was a lot of texture going on the top. It almost had like a little a tufted area of hair. It was like it had a little wig on the top of its head, and trying to get the texture simplified was the hardest part for me for this particular animal. And I think I'd definitely like to go back and study that a little bit more. I really enjoyed doing the almost like, not folds, but blocks of fur on the neck towards the top where you can see the shadows and then the light. I really loved layering those chunks of fur. That was a really enjoyable process to do. And I also just enjoyed shifting the different warm and cool tones, especially in the legs. I enjoyed shifting those around a lot, but I would say that the top of the head was the struggle point with this. At least it was the struggle point with the with the subject, because the background is where I ended up having real problems. So I'm probably going to talk about where I decided to make a change to the palette. I mentioned much earlier in this video that the Lunar Earth was a pigment that I hadn't really explored that much, and I haven't had a permanent place on any of my palettes for it. I think I got it for Christmas one year, I'm not too sure, but I've had it in my box of paints for a while, and I would occasionally pick it up and play around with it, use it in mixes, and try to figure out what I would use it for. And again, I never ended up putting it on any of my palettes. I would just bring it out to play around with. I leave such a long time between experimenting with it that I kind of forgot why I have never put it on a palette before. And it's because I don't like how it granulates sometimes. I like how it granulates sometimes, and I also hate how it granulates sometimes. And unfortunately, it was a hate situation with the background here. What I don't like about this pigment is that it just sits where it is. And that's not really what I want from a granulating pigment. It does granulate a lot, but it also just sat there and didn't move at all. So I just ended up with these really ugly, to me, ugly clumps of the pigment just sat there. And it wasn't like I was putting the pigment down on the paper and trying to mix it into a wash. I was mixing the wash on the palette, and then it was just all clumping together in one tiny section. And I would end up with these clumps, is the best way I can describe it, just clumps of the Lunar Earth in not pleasant compositions, and it was not a fun time for me. I ended up trying to salvage the situation, which I did in saving mode. So it wasn't planned for, and because it wasn't planned for, I ended up not having a plan going in trying to save it. The plan was to make sure that what I did covered up most of what I didn't like, but in doing so I ended up making the background not how I wanted to make it. I wanted it to be these muted earth tones. I didn't want it to be a super vibrant, saturated green, and that's what I ended up doing in the moment to save what I was painting. And that's just what happens sometimes when you're sketching and you're experimenting. Like I said going into this, the entire reason I'm even doing this painting is to test this palette, and it served its purpose, right? So this was a success, because it showed me that I do not want this paint as a permanent feature on a palette. So what I've ended up doing is I've scooped out the paint. It's dry. I scooped it out with a palette knife, and I've put it into a full pan, and it's been put into my full pan storage to bring out when I want to experiment with it. But this is the result. And experiments are going to have aha moments, and sometimes the aha moments involve struggle like this. I hope though that sharing all of the ups and downs helps other people out there, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!